Victoria Blackwood stood at her floor-to-ceiling window, martini glass in hand, observing with disdain as her new neighbor struggled to unload boxes from a beaten-up Toyota Corolla. The sight of the rusty vehicle parked in the driveway of 42 Maple Avenue, one of the most prestigious addresses in Westbrook Heights, made her blood boil. "Charles!" she called out to her husband, who was absorbed in his Wall Street Journal. "Come look at this disaster. How did the Homeowners Association even allow this?" The woman outside couldn't have been more than 35, wearing faded jeans and a simple grey t-shirt that had seen better days. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she moved with a determined efficiency that spoke of someone used to doing everything herself. "That's Sarah Mitchell," Charles replied without looking up from his paper. "Single, works as a nurse at County General. The house belonged to her grandmother, Margaret Mitchell. Remember her?" Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her glass. Of course she remembered Margaret Mitchell, the sweet old lady who had lived there for decades, always with a kind word and fresh-baked cookies for the neighborhood children. But that was different. Margaret, despite her modest means, had maintained her property immaculately. This was an entirely different matter. "Well, she's going to drag down our property values," Victoria declared, watching as Sarah attempted to maneuver a large box through her front door. "Just look at that car. And those clothes. This is Westbrook Heights, not some downtown apartment complex." Charles finally looked up, his eyes tired behind his reading glasses. "Vic, give it a rest. The woman just lost her grandmother and inherited her only property. Show some compassion." But Victoria wasn't interested in compassion. She had worked too hard to reach her status in life, married to a successful investment banker, president of the Westbrook Heights Women's Association, and known for hosting the most exclusive charity galas in town. She wouldn't let some shabby nurse diminish everything she had built. The next morning, Victoria was meticulously pruning her prize-winning roses when she spotted Sarah leaving for work. The younger woman was dressed in purple scrubs, her hair now neatly braided, carrying what appeared to be a large cooler alongside her work bag. She walked with purpose, seemingly oblivious to Victoria's scrutinizing gaze. "Good morning," Sarah called out cheerfully, waving as she passed. Victoria merely nodded, then turned back to her roses, making a mental note to bring up property maintenance standards at the next Homeowners Association meeting. She had standards to maintain, after all. Throughout the week, Victoria kept a careful eye on her new neighbor. Sarah's schedule seemed erratic, leaving at odd hours, returning late at night, sometimes not coming home at all for what appeared to be days at a time. "Probably picking up extra shifts to make ends meet," Victoria surmised to her friends over lunch at the country club, not bothering to lower her voice. I mean, how else could she afford to keep up that property? But it was what happened on Sunday that really set Victoria's teeth on edge. A parade of old, modest vehicles began arriving at Sarah's house early in the morning. Out stepped elderly people, some using canes or walkers, others helped by what appeared to be their adult children. They all disappeared into Sarah's house, carrying dishes and bags. "It's like she's running some sort of senior center," Victoria exclaimed, watching the scene unfold from behind her curtains. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a community center." Charles, who was preparing for a round of golf, paused to observe the gathering. "Looks more like a community lunch to me. Maybe she's continuing one of Margaret's traditions." Victoria scoffed. "There's a difference between having a few friends over for tea and turning your home into Grand Central Station for every retiree in the county." But as Victoria watched, she noticed something peculiar. These elderly visitors, despite their modest dress and vehicles, carried themselves with dignity. They greeted each other warmly, helped one another up the porch steps, and their laughter carried across the manicured lawns. It was a sound that seemed strangely out of place in their perfectly manicured, usually quiet neighborhood. That evening, as the visitors were leaving, Victoria overheard snippets of conversation through her open window. "Thank you so much, Sarah dear. These Sunday gatherings mean the world to us." Don't forget your medication schedule, Mr. Peterson. I'll check on you tomorrow after my shift. Sarah, the soup was wonderful, just like your grandmother used to make. Victoria found herself drawn to her window, watching as Sarah hugged each departing guest, helped them to their cars, and made sure they left safely. There was something in those interactions that tugged at Victoria's carefully maintained composure, a genuine warmth that all her expensive charity galas somehow failed to capture. Little did Victoria know, but this Sunday gathering was just the beginning. The following days would reveal secrets about Sarah Mitchell that would shake Victoria's perfectly ordered world to its core, forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about wealth, worth, and what truly makes a neighborhood prestigious. As the sun set over Westbrook Heights, casting long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns, Victoria stood at her window once again. She watched as Sarah collected forgotten sweaters and Tupperware from her porch, her movements unhurried despite the long day. For the first time, Victoria felt a flicker of curiosity about her new neighbor, and perhaps, though she wouldn't admit it yet, a tiny seed of doubt about her own hasty judgments. The first part of our story sets up the conflict between Victoria's materialistic values and Sarah's more compassionate approach to life. Would you like me to continue with part 2, where we'll discover more about Sarah's mysterious work with the elderly and see how it begins to affect Victoria? The Tuesday morning calm at Victoria's luxurious home was shattered by the sound of sirens. She rushed to her window, silk robe fluttering, to see an ambulance parked in front of Sarah's house. Her initial reaction was smug satisfaction. Surely this would prove her point about the unsuitable activities taking place next door. But what she witnessed instead left her strangely unsettled. Sarah emerged from her house alongside paramedics who were carefully transporting an elderly man on a stretcher. Instead of seeming panicked or overwhelmed, Sarah moved with professional calm, rattling off medical terms and vital statistics to the EMTs. She held the man's hand, leaning down to speak softly to him as they loaded him into the ambulance. "That's old Mr. Peterson," Charles commented from behind his morning paper. "Lives alone since his wife passed. No children." Victoria watched as Sarah climbed into her Toyota, following the ambulance. The scene nagged at her throughout her morning yoga session and lunch with the charity committee. There was something about Sarah's competence, her quiet authority, that didn't fit Victoria's narrative of the shabby neighbor bringing down property values. Later that afternoon, Victoria was trimming her hedges, a task she usually left to the gardener. But she needed an excuse to observe the comings and goings next door when a sleek Mercedes pulled into Sarah's driveway. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. "Sarah," he called out warmly as she opened her door. "I brought the papers you requested. Everything's in order." Victoria's pruning shears stilled. She recognized him immediately. James Harrison, one of the most prestigious estate lawyers in town. What business could he possibly have with Sarah? Their conversation drifted across the lawn. "Thank you, James. This will help so many of them." "I know it's not your usual fee structure." "Please," he interrupted. "After what you did for my mother in her final months, this is the least I can do. The foundation paperwork will be filed tomorrow." Foundation? Victoria's curiosity was definitely piqued now. The mystery deepened the following day when Victoria spotted Sarah helping an elderly woman into her car. The woman was impeccably dressed in designer clothes that even Victoria recognized as high-end. "That's Eleanor Rothschild," her housekeeper Maria whispered, pausing in her dusting. "Her family owns half the buildings downtown. They say she hasn't left her estate since Mr. Rothschild died last year." Yet here she was, willingly climbing into Sarah's beat-up Toyota. Victoria watched them drive away, her world view shifting uncomfortably. That evening, Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She marched across her manicured lawn to Sarah's front door, determined to get answers. But as she raised her hand to knock, she heard voices through the open window. "I don't know how to thank you, Sarah," a trembling voice said. "When Thomas had his stroke, I was so lost. The other nurses at the hospital were kind, but you gave us hope again. And now, organizing all these services for seniors like us who can't manage alone. Mrs. Chen, please. I'm just continuing what my grandmother started. She always said wealth isn't about what's in your bank account. It's about how rich your life is in moments of connection. Victoria's hand dropped to her side. She remembered Margaret Mitchell then, not just as a neighbor who baked cookies, but as a constant presence during the darkest time in Victoria's own life. When Victoria's mother was dying of cancer 15 years ago, Margaret had appeared every day with food, comfort, and quiet wisdom. The memory hit her like a physical blow. How had she forgotten? Through the window, she could see Sarah sitting with an elderly Asian woman, their heads bent over what appeared to be medical documents. The room was modest but warm, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together. Photos covered the walls. Not expensive art like in Victoria's home, but countless snapshots of elderly faces, all smiling or looking at the photographer with obvious affection. "The foundation will help," Sarah was saying, "but we need to be realistic about long-term care options. Have you considered—" Victoria backed away from the door, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. She felt oddly exposed, standing there in her expensive clothes, her carefully maintained exterior suddenly seeming like armor rather than elegance. But it was what she discovered the next day that truly shattered her preconceptions. While organizing the annual charity gala, her crown jewel of social events, Victoria made a routine call to the local newspaper about coverage. The conversation took an unexpected turn. "Oh yes, Mrs. Blackwood, we'll definitely have someone there," the editor assured her. "By the way, you must be thrilled about your new neighbor. Sarah Mitchell's work with the End of Life Dignity Project has been remarkable. Did you know she was just nominated for the National Compassionate Care Award? She's transformed how we approach elder care in this city. The series we ran about her last month had the highest readership we've seen in years." Victoria nearly dropped her phone. She spent the next hour online, reading everything she could find about Sarah Mitchell. The story that emerged left her stunned. Sarah hadn't just inherited her grandmother's house, she had inherited her mission. Margaret Mitchell, it turned out, had spent decades quietly helping elderly neighbors remain independent, building an informal network of support that kept seniors out of nursing homes and connected to their community. Sarah, with her nursing background and organizational skills, had taken that mission and transformed it into something extraordinary. The shabby clothes, the odd hours, the constant visitors, it all made sense now. Sarah wasn't struggling to maintain her grandmother's standards. She was channeling every resource she had into supporting vulnerable seniors. The foundation James Harrison was helping her establish would provide free in-home nursing care, companionship, and advocacy for elderly residents who wanted to age in place. Victoria sat back in her expensive office chair, surrounded by the trappings of wealth she'd spent her life accumulating, and felt something shift inside her. She thought about her own mother's final months, about Margaret Mitchell's quiet presence, and about how she'd spent years hosting charity galas that raised impressive amounts of money, but somehow never seemed to create the kind of tangible change she was witnessing next door. As the sun set over Westbrook Heights, Victoria watched through her window as Sarah's Toyota pulled into the driveway. She emerged, looking exhausted, still in her scrubs, carrying that same large cooler she took to work every day. But there was something else about her, a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with designer clothes or luxury cars. Victoria didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring a revelation that would force her to confront not just her prejudices, but her own deepest fears about aging, mortality, and what truly matters at the end of life. The carefully constructed walls of her social world were about to come crashing down in a way she never could have anticipated. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Victoria was reviewing seating arrangements for her upcoming charity gala when she heard Charles's coffee cup shatter on the kitchen floor. The sound of breaking china was followed by something far more terrifying: silence. She found him gripping the counter, his face ashen, right arm hanging limply at his side. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as she watched him try to speak, his words slurring incomprehensibly. Victoria had always prided herself on maintaining control in any situation, but in that moment, all her carefully cultivated poise deserted her. She screamed for Maria, their housekeeper, who had the presence of mind to call 911, but it was what happened next that truly shook Victoria's world. Sarah's voice cut through the panic. "I heard screaming. What's—" She assessed the situation in an instant, switching seamlessly into professional mode. "He's having a stroke. How long has he been like this?" Before Victoria could process her neighbor's presence, Sarah was already in motion, directing Charles to sit, checking his vital signs, and rattling off critical information to the 911 dispatcher on speakerphone. Her movements were swift and sure, her voice calm and authoritative. "Victoria," Sarah said firmly, "I need you to focus. When did Charles last take his blood pressure medication?" The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. How did Sarah know about Charles's medication? More importantly, why didn't Victoria, his own wife, know when he'd last taken it? The next few hours passed in a blur of ambulance sirens, emergency room fluorescent lights, and medical terminology that made Victoria's head spin. Through it all, Sarah remained by their side, translating medical jargon and advocating for specific tests based on Charles's history. It wasn't until late that evening, sitting in the CCU waiting room, that Victoria finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "How did you know about his medication?" Sarah looked up from the medical chart she'd been reviewing. "Charles has been coming to our seniors' health management sessions on Sundays. He was concerned about his blood pressure and wanted to learn more about managing it naturally. Didn't he tell you?" Victoria felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Her husband, the man she'd been married to for 30 years, had been secretly attending Sarah's senior health sessions, the same gatherings she'd dismissed as bringing down the neighborhood's tone. "He said he was playing golf," Victoria whispered, her perfectly manicured hands trembling in her lap. Sarah's expression softened. "Victoria, Charles was worried about you. He said you've both spent so many years focusing on maintaining appearances that you've lost touch with what's really important. He wanted to make changes, but he didn't know how to broach the subject with you." The truth hit Victoria with devastating clarity. While she'd been obsessing over property values and social status, her husband had been secretly seeking help from the very neighbor she'd looked down upon. The realization made her feel hollow inside. But Sarah wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know. Your mother, Elizabeth, she was one of my grandmother's first care recipients." Victoria's head snapped up. "What?" "When your mother was dying, Margaret, my grandmother didn't just bring food. She was part of an informal network of neighbors who provided end-of-life care. Your mother made her promise to keep it quiet. She didn't want you to know she needed help." The memory of those final months with her mother suddenly shifted, details clicking into place. The mysteriously clean house whenever Victoria visited, despite her mother's weakness. The fresh flowers that appeared daily. The way her mother always seemed freshly bathed and dressed, even as the cancer consumed her. "But we had money," Victoria protested weakly. "We could have hired help." "Your mother told my grandmother that what she needed most wasn't something money could buy. She needed human connection, dignity, and the comfort of community. That's what inspired me to become a nurse and continue my grandmother's work." Victoria felt tears sliding down her cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. All these years, she'd thrown herself into organizing charity galas and maintaining social status, thinking it would somehow honor her mother's memory. But she'd completely missed the true legacy of care and compassion that had been right next door. "Charles will recover," Sarah continued gently, "but he'll need support. Not just medical care, but a different kind of lifestyle. Less stress, more genuine connection. The kind of support our community provides." Victoria stared through the CCU window at her husband's sleeping form, remembering the vital, loving man she'd married. When had they started prioritizing appearances over their actual lives? When had their beautiful home become a showcase rather than a place of comfort? A commotion at the end of the hall drew their attention. Eleanor Rothschild was marching toward them, still elegant in her designer clothes, but with a determination Victoria had never seen before. "I came as soon as I heard," Eleanor announced. "Charles is one of our most dedicated participants. The breathing exercises he learned in our stress management group have been remarkable for his blood pressure." Victoria's world tilted again. Eleanor Rothschild, the woman whose social approval Victoria had spent years trying to earn, had been part of Sarah's senior support network all along. "Victoria," Eleanor said, taking her hand, "it's time you knew what's really been happening in our neighborhood. Sarah isn't just running support groups. She's revolutionizing how we think about aging, community, and what real wealth means. And after what happened with Charles today, you need to hear the whole story." As Eleanor began to speak, Victoria realized she was about to discover something that would fundamentally change not just her view of Sarah, but her entire understanding of what made a community truly prestigious. The revelation would force her to confront the hollow nature of the life she'd built and make a decision that would either heal or completely destroy her marriage to Charles. Eleanor's story unfolded in the sterile hospital waiting room, her perfectly modulated voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "When Richard died last year," she began, "everyone expected me to handle it with my usual grace. The wealthy widow, maintaining her dignity in her marble mansion. But the truth is, I was drowning." Victoria remembered the perfectly worded condolence note she'd sent, the expensive flower arrangement, the tasteful appearance at the funeral. She'd thought she'd done everything right. "Do you know who actually saved me?" Eleanor continued. "Sarah Mitchell. She found me one morning, still in my silk pajamas, having not eaten for days. She didn't care about my name or my social status. She just saw someone who needed help." The story that followed left Victoria speechless. Sarah had not only helped Eleanor through her grief, but had shown her a new purpose in life. The Rothschild Foundation, it turned out, wasn't just providing financial backing for Sarah's elder care program. It was revolutionizing how wealthy seniors could use their resources to support their less fortunate peers. "That's what your charity galas could never achieve, Victoria," Eleanor said gently. "Real change doesn't happen at black tie events. It happens in living rooms and kitchens, when people connect as human beings, not social categories." A nurse interrupted them, announcing that Charles was awake and asking for Victoria. As she entered his room, the sight of her strong, capable husband looking so vulnerable made her heart clench. "Vic," he said, his voice slightly slurred but clear enough, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the sessions." Victoria took his hand, noticing how frail it felt in hers. "Why didn't you?" "Because you were so focused on appearances. The right clothes, the right car, the right friends. I didn't know how to tell you that what I really needed was something simpler, something real." The words struck Victoria like physical blows. She thought about all the times she'd dismissed Charles's attempts to slow down, to spend quiet evenings at home instead of attending social functions. How many signs had she missed while maintaining their perfect facade? Over the next few days, as Charles began his recovery, Victoria witnessed firsthand the community Sarah had built. Hospital staff treated them differently when Sarah was around, offering extra attention and care. Other seniors from the support group brought home-cooked meals to their house, sharing stories about how Charles had helped them with financial advice or computer problems. "He's been teaching a financial literacy class for seniors," Mrs. Chen explained while delivering a casserole, "helping us understand how to protect our savings and avoid scams. He said it made him feel more useful than all his years in investment banking." Victoria found herself spending more time at Sarah's house, no longer as a spy checking on property values, but as someone desperate to understand. She watched Sarah coordinate care schedules, train volunteers, and handle medical emergencies with quiet competence. The shabby furniture and mismatched dishes no longer seemed like signs of poverty, but evidence of priorities focused on service rather than show. One evening, while helping Sarah sort medical supplies, Victoria found herself sharing stories about her mother's final months. I thought I was protecting her by hiring the best doctors, buying the most expensive treatments. But what she really needed was what Margaret gave her, someone to hold her hand, to listen to her fears, to make her feel human, instead of just a patient. Sarah nodded, her hands steady as she organized medication containers. That's what my grandmother taught me. True wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. Every person who walks through that door is carrying something heavy. Sometimes it's physical pain, sometimes it's loneliness, sometimes it's fear. Our job is to help carry that burden, even if just for a little while. Victoria thought about her upcoming charity gala, the elaborate centerpieces she'd ordered, the exclusive guest list she'd curated. For the first time, she saw it all clearly, how she'd substituted the appearance of caring for actual care, how she'd used charity as a way to elevate her social status rather than truly help others. The next morning, Victoria made a decision that would shock Westbrook Heights society. She cancelled the gala instead. She wrote a personal check, matching what the event would have raised, and handed it to Sarah. "I want to help," she said simply. "Not with a fancy party, but with real work. Teach me." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Actually, there is something you could help with. We've been trying to establish a program to help seniors navigate the healthcare system. With your organizational skills and Charles's financial knowledge." But before Victoria could respond, Maria burst through the door, her face pale with panic. "Mrs. Blackwood, come quickly! Mr. Charles, he's having another episode!" The next few moments would test everything Victoria had learned, forcing her to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed social image and embracing a new way of living. The decision she made would not only determine Charles's future, but would reshape the entire community of Westbrook Heights in ways nobody could have predicted. Victoria's world narrowed to a single focus as she raced into her house behind Maria. Charles was in his study, slumped over his desk, but this time something was different. Victoria didn't freeze, she didn't panic. Instead, she found herself moving with a calm purpose she didn't know she possessed. "Call Sarah," she instructed Maria, while checking Charles's vital signs the way she'd seen Sarah do. "Then 911, tell them possible stroke, patient with recent history." By the time Sarah arrived minutes later, Victoria had already helped Charles to the floor and was supporting his head, speaking to him in soothing tones. The paramedics found them working as a team, Sarah handling the medical aspects, while Victoria provided steady emotional support. In the ambulance, holding Charles's hand, Victoria made a vow. Not a public promise for show, but a quiet, profound commitment to change. She understood now what real strength looked like, and it had nothing to do with designer labels or social status. The next few weeks transformed the Blackwood mansion. Victoria converted their formal dining room into a community meeting space for Sarah's senior health programs. The garden, once a showcase of expensive landscaping, now included raised beds where seniors could grow their own vegetables as part of physical therapy. Charles's recovery was slower this time, but different. Instead of hiding his condition from their social circle, Victoria opened their home to the community Sarah had built. Their perfectly decorated living room became a place where other stroke survivors gathered to share their experiences and support each other. "You know what the funny thing is," Charles said one evening, his speech still slightly impaired but improving. "I used to think we needed all this, the perfect house, the perfect clothes, the perfect reputation to be happy. But I've never felt more alive than I do now, surrounded by real people with real stories." Victoria understood exactly what he meant. She discovered that true fulfillment came not from maintaining appearances, but from making a genuine difference in people's lives. Her organizational skills, once devoted to planning exclusive social events, now helped coordinate a network of volunteers and resources for elderly neighbors in need. 6 months after Charles's second stroke, Victoria stood in Sarah's kitchen, helping to prepare meals for homebound seniors. The counters were cluttered with cooking supplies, the air rich with the smell of homemade soup. Through the window, she could see Eleanor Rothschild teaching a Tai Chi class on Sarah's lawn to a group of seniors, her designer workout clothes mixed with others' simple attire. "I never thanked you properly," Victoria said to Sarah, who was showing a new volunteer how to portion meals. "For what?" "For showing me what real wealth looks like. I spent years thinking I was building something important, but I was just creating a beautiful prison for myself." Sarah smiled, her hands steady as she sealed another container. "You know what my grandmother always said? The size of your house doesn't matter nearly as much as how many people feel at home in it." Victoria looked around the kitchen she'd once judged as shabby. She saw now what she'd missed before: the warmth, the love, the sense of purpose in every scratched counter and mismatched chair. Each imperfection told a story of lives touched, of help given, of community built. The following Sunday, Victoria hosted her first senior community dinner in her own home. She used her fine china, not to impress, but because she finally understood that honoring others meant sharing your best with them. The marble floors she'd once been so proud of were scuffed by walkers and wheelchairs, each mark a badge of honor rather than a flaw. As she looked around her transformed home, filled with laughter and life, Victoria realized that true prestige wasn't about exclusion, it was about inclusion. Real wealth wasn't measured in dollars or social status, but in the number of lives you touched and the depth of connections you built. Charles, now leading a financial literacy workshop for seniors from his wheelchair in their former formal living room, caught her eye and smiled. They had lost the perfectly curated life they'd worked so hard to maintain, but they'd gained something far more valuable: authenticity, purpose, and genuine community. A year to the day after Sarah moved into Margaret's old house, Victoria stood at her window again. But this time, she wasn't judging or critiquing. She was watching Sarah help Mr. Peterson with his physical therapy exercises in her front yard, while Eleanor led another Tai Chi class on the lawn. The property values of Westbrook Heights hadn't dropped as Victoria had once feared. Instead, the neighborhood had become known for something far more valuable than expensive homes and manicured lawns. It had become a model for what a truly wealthy community could be. That evening, as Victoria helped serve dinner to their weekly senior group, she overheard someone ask Sarah how she'd managed to transform their neighborhood so completely. Sarah's response brought tears to Victoria's eyes. "I didn't do it alone." Sometimes the people who seem most opposed to change are actually the ones most ready for it. They just need to be reminded of what truly matters in life. Victoria understood then that her journey hadn't just been about learning to accept Sarah or about changing her views on wealth and status. It had been about rediscovering her own humanity, buried under years of social expectations and artificial standards. As she looked around at the gathering, Charles teaching a senior how to use an iPad, Eleanor discussing gardening tips with Mrs. Chen, Sarah coordinating the next week's care schedules, Victoria felt truly rich for the first time in her life. She had learned that real wealth wasn't something you could buy or show off. It was something you built day by day, through acts of kindness, through genuine connections, and through the willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the true worth of every person. The sun set over Westbrook Heights, casting a golden glow over both mansions and modest homes alike. In the warmth of that light, surrounded by the community she had once judged so harshly, Victoria finally understood what her mother and Margaret Mitchell had known all along: that the most prestigious address in the world meant nothing without a heart that was open to sharing it with others. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is very valuable to our community. To the left of your screen, you'll find a story that will make you reflect as much as this one. a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, filled with unexpected twists and life lessons that will touch your heart. If you like this story, subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing exciting stories every day, stories that help us grow, reflect, and see life from a new perspective. Each subscription helps us keep this space alive where great life lessons are told through stories that reach the soul. See you in the next story.